Besides the auto unions, team manager Neubauer is here with 3 Mercedes. Their engines have over 300 horsepower, and all 4 wheels are sprung independently. With them are experts on tires, fuel, and carburation.
The year is 1934. In the green hills of Germany, a race known as the Eifel is about to commence. Now, this story is a little bit controversial, but hear me out anyway.
Based on its engineers, no ceiling on its ambition. A car that would make the normally stiff, conservative brand from Stuttgart completely lose their minds. They called it the CLK GTR. And this is its story. To understand why the CLK GTR exists, you need to rewind to 1993, when the World Sports Car Championship collapsed and left an enormous, gaping wound in the world of motorsport. Outside of Le Mans and Formula One, there was suddenly nowhere meaningful for the world's greatest automotive brands to wage war against each other on a global stage. Enter a group of absolute madmen who decided to stitch several smaller racing series together and breathe life back into European endurance racing. What they created was called the BPR Global GT Series, and at first it was a relatively modest affair. Porsches, a few Venturi racers, nothing too extraordinary. But the big dogs noticed. And they came running. Jaguar brought the XJ220. Ferrari fielded the spectacular F40 GT. The eternal 911 showed up and did what the 911 always does, dominated. Even the long-forgotten De Tomaso Pantera made an appearance, bless its heart. Everything was reasonably competitive, exciting even, until Gordon Murray arrived and ruined everything. The McLaren F1 GTR didn't just win races in 1995. It humiliated the competition. For 12 consecutive races, the podiums looked like McLaren had been the only team that bothered to show up. Ferrari, Jaguar, Porsche, all of them were reduced to fighting over scraps while Gordon Murray's masterpiece waltzed to victory after victory. It was beautiful if you were British and absolutely soul-crushing if you were anyone else. Then the FIA stepped in with a rule change that was supposed to level the playing field. New homologation requirements meant manufacturers only needed to produce 25 road-going examples to qualify for competition. Just 25 cars. On paper, this tiny number was an invitation, a dare, really, for the world's exotic car manufacturers to unleash something truly extraordinary. Build 25 street cars, they said, and your race car has almost no restrictions. In theory, this should have knocked McLaren off its throne. It didn't. Not immediately. Because Porsche, being Porsche, had decided their entire corporate identity depended on winning this fight. They took a Le Mans winning 1962 Group C prototype, a screaming monster running over 740 horsepower, and realized they had a problem. It didn't look remotely like a production car and they needed street examples to homologate. So Porsche engineers performed an act of automotive alchemy. They grafted the front end of the 993 911, the last great air-cooled 911, onto the rear of the 962 race car, performed enormous amounts of engineering wizardry, and produced one of the most insane automobiles ever built. The Porsche 911 GT1, a massive, elongated, aerodynamic twin-turbocharged hypercar that vaguely resembled a 911 while sharing almost nothing with one. In its debut at the 24 Hours of Le Mans, it finished second and third overall, one lap behind a full prototype. When it arrived late in the 1996 BPR season, it was untouchable. So dominant was the GT1 that Ferrari quietly abandoned development of the F50 GT1. Teams sat in dark garages at the end of 1996, staring at the ceiling and wondering if any of this was even worth it. One brand, though, looked at the Porsche 911 GT1 and didn't see an insurmountable obstacle. They saw a blueprint. It is early December 1996. Christmas music is drifting through the streets of Stuttgart. The holidays are approaching. Most of Europe is winding down for the year. Not at AMG. The engineers at AMG received word from Mercedes-Benz leadership that their New Year's resolution was going to be conquering the motorsport world. Their mission: study the Porsche 911 GT1, a purebred prototype race car wearing a few Porsche headlights as a disguise, and build something better. Their deadline: 128 days. 128 days to design, engineer, build, and race a car capable of defeating the most dominant machine in the sport. For context, that's roughly the time it takes for a tree to grow 3 inches. The team had no choice but to get creative. And when you're running out of time, creativity sometimes looks a lot like theft. Great artists steal, as they say. So, AMG stole brilliantly. First, they purchased a McLaren F1 GTR, chassis number 11R, and committed what any purist would consider a crime against automotive history. They stripped it completely, tore the body off, installed their own experimental power plant, and used Gordon Murray's chassis as a rolling test laboratory. They learned everything they could from the architecture of the greatest race car of the decade. Then they carefully reassembled it, restored the original engine, and quietly sold it at auction to make the whole episode disappear. Murray never consented to any of it. His masterpiece had been reverse-engineered in secret. With the chassis knowledge now absorbed, the AMG team turned to their second victim, the Porsche 911 GT1. They studied its proportions, its body lines, its philosophy. Then they dressed their creation in CLK clothing, headlights, grille, taillights, all borrowed from Mercedes' road-going sports coupe. The aerodynamics were refined through a combination of wind tunnel data, clay modeling, and what witnesses described charitably as inspired improvisation. The resulting designs were sent to Lola Composites, who manufactured the carbon fiber chassis at extraordinary speed. For the heart of this beast, AMG reached into their parts catalog and pulled out the M120, a massive aluminum V12 that powered the flagship S-Class sedan, and proceeded to transform it into something entirely different. Titanium components replaced heavier parts. Compression ratios climbed. The displacement sat at 6 liters, 12 cylinders, and the result was 600 naturally aspirated horses that screamed with a sound unlike almost anything else in racing. Not the bass thunder of a touring car. Not the shriek of a Formula One engine. Something in between, metallic, haunting, operatic. An idol that was almost a whine. A full-throttle note that made grown engineers stand still and just listen. Connected to a 6-speed sequential gearbox, this colossal machine could dispatch 60 miles per hour in under 4 seconds and reach 200 miles per hour without apparent effort. 2 of them were ready in April 1997, 128 days after the project began. The miracles, unfortunately, stopped there. At the Hockenheimring, Mercedes' home circuit, in front of their home crowd, both CLK GTRs suffered brake failures and mechanical disasters. 27th place was the best they could manage. The Porsche that inspired it finished ahead. The McLaren they wanted to destroy finished ahead. A Dodge Viper finished ahead. Gordon Murray and his extraordinary hair remained comfortably at the top of the world. But the team at AMG didn't fold. They went back to Stuttgart, fixed the brakes, tightened the loose ends, and came back angrier. Their first podium arrived a month later at Silverstone. A third CLK GTR joined the team for Helsinki, though disaster struck again. But with every race, the gap was closing. The car was learning. The team was learning. And when the CLK GTRs rolled out onto the pit lane at the Nürburgring for the 4-hour race, something felt different. After a contentious qualifying session, the front of the grid was entirely CLKs and F1s. And 146 laps later, 2 silver arrows led a convoy of 5 McLarens across the finish line. Bernd Schneider and Klaus Ludwig stood on the top step of the podium, in the same hills where, over 60 years earlier, a stripped paint job had launched a legend. After that, Mercedes simply would not lose. The top 3 finishers at every subsequent race included a silver arrow. By season's end, AMG returned to Stuttgart holding both the drivers' and manufacturers' championships. There was just one complication waiting at the door. A firm knock from the FIA. They had been promised street cars. They wanted to see them. The road-going CLK GTR was, by any reasonable definition, a race car with a license plate. Mercedes had committed to building 25 road-legal examples, and they had to scramble through the off-season to construct most of them after prioritizing racing throughout the season. The result, to the extraordinary benefit of the 25 buyers who could afford them, was an automobile with essentially no separation between competition and road use. Hans Werner Aufrecht, the A in AMG, oversaw the streetcar program. Each example took 3 to 4 weeks to build. The modifications from the race specification were genuinely minimal. The V12 was expanded to 6.9 liters, with softer camshaft profiles for improved low-speed manners and torque. The aerodynamics were slightly calmed down. Airbags appeared. Catalytic converters were fitted. And if you were extraordinarily fortunate and had specifically requested it, your CLK GTR arrived with air conditioning. That was roughly the extent of the civilizing process. What remained was the same carbon fiber monocoque chassis, the same howling V12 mounted inches behind your head, the same sequential transmission, now operated through steering wheel-mounted paddles, the same savage, uncompromising character that had annihilated the world's greatest race cars across European circuits. The price was $1.5 million, double what a McLaren F1 cost at the time, making the CLK GTR the most expensive production car in the world, a record it held for nearly 2 decades until Ferrari's FXX eventually claimed it. Even at that price, buyers understood they were getting a bargain. They were purchasing a championship-winning race car for the road. They were purchasing history. History that was extremely difficult to actually drive. The CLK GTR hated low speeds with a passion that felt almost personal. Its 4-plate carbon fiber racing clutch was essentially unforgiving in traffic. It stuttered and bucked on upshifts at pedestrian velocities. It barely maintained traction in the lower gears under any meaningful throttle application. There was no rearview mirror. There were no cup holders. There was no storage space of any kind. Entering the cabin required climbing over door sills nearly a foot high before folding yourself into a space that seemed designed with a very specific, very lean, very short German test driver in mind. If you did fit, what greeted you was a modest collection of standard Mercedes-Benz instruments, some switches sourced from the parts bin, and a radio that served as a reminder that this car had technically met the minimum requirements for road use. You didn't buy a CLK GTR to use the radio. You bought it to press the starter, hear the V12 erupt to life behind your skull, feel the entire chassis vibrate at idle, and understand on a visceral level that you were sitting inside something genuinely dangerous and genuinely alive. Or, more practically, you bought it because you understood that time would transform your $1.5 million into something considerably more valuable. Most of the surviving examples have covered only a few thousand miles. The cars are simply too demanding, too rare, too ferociously difficult for most roads and most drivers. Many live in climate-controlled garages, occasionally traveling to auction houses where they trade hands for sums that would make their original purchase price seem almost reasonable. In 2002, AMG added one final chapter to the CLK GTR story, a roadster version, an open-top interpretation of an already impossibly rare machine. When the final count was taken, the total stood at approximately 28 examples for civilian ownership, 2 prototypes, 20 coupes, and 6 roadsters. Each one a street-legal artifact from one of the most extraordinary periods in motorsport history. In 1998, the CLK GTR returned to defend its title in the FIA GT Championship. 10 races. 10 victories. Not a single loss. Porsche couldn't touch it. McLaren couldn't touch it. Ferrari wasn't even trying anymore. The Silver Arrow had become something almost unfair. Something that no reasonable competitor could be expected to match. And so, in 1999, the GT1 class was cancelled. Not because of a rule change or a safety concern. Simply because nobody wanted to compete anymore. The CLK GTR had won so completely, so comprehensively, that it had eliminated the very series that gave it purpose. Like a fire that burns so hot it consumes all available fuel, the CLK GTR had destroyed its own ecosystem. Mercedes, now flush with confidence and hungry for the ultimate prize, made the decision to take their Silver Arrow to Le Mans, a decision that must have felt inevitable and would ultimately prove catastrophic. The wounds of 1955 had never fully healed at Mercedes. That terrible June day at La Sarthe, when over 80 lives were lost in a cascade of split-second decisions, had kept the company away from motorsport's greatest stage for 3 decades. The CLK GTR's dominance finally convinced them to return. The problem was the CLK GTR wasn't built for Le Mans. Its aerodynamics were designed for circuits that didn't feature miles of flat-out, barely guided acceleration through the French countryside. AMG revised the bodywork and replaced the V12 with a more reliable V8 sourced from the Sauber C9 prototype, creating the CLK LM. At the 1998 race, it was extraordinary in qualifying. Schneider put it on pole position, a full second ahead of Toyota's best. The race, however, ended early when power steering failures took out both cars within the first few hours. Undaunted, Mercedes designed an entirely new Le Mans machine for 1999, the CLR. Lower, faster, lighter, unshackled from homologation requirements. A purpose-built weapon for the world's most demanding race. What followed was one of the most haunting episodes in modern motorsport. During qualifying, Mark Webber was drafting an Audi prototype when the ambient air caught the CLR's bodywork and launched him skyward. He was hospitalized with minor injuries. The team repaired the car and sent it back out. It happened again. Webber climbed out, thankfully uninjured, but the message was impossible to ignore. The aerodynamics were fundamentally wrong at Le Mans speeds. The front end went light. The car wanted to fly. Emergency modifications were made. A McLaren Formula One aerodynamicist was consulted. Plastic corrections were added to the front splitter. Drivers were instructed to maintain distance from other cars. 4 hours into the race, Peter Dumbreck was chasing a Toyota GT1 down the Mulsanne Straight at roughly 200 miles per hour, driving into the setting sun with almost no visibility. His CLR rolled over a small curb. The aerodynamic disruption was enough. The car launched 50 feet into the air, rotated 3 times, cleared the barriers, and disappeared down a hillside. Dumbreck was unconscious on impact. He climbed out unharmed. In a moment that said everything about the French bureaucracy, he was breathalyzed on the scene before being transported to hospital. Mercedes immediately withdrew the remaining car. The program was over. The CLK GTR's legacy is complicated, as all great stories tend to be. In most people's memory, the Le Mans disasters overshadow the championship victories. The airborne CLR became the defining image of the program, more memorable than the Nürburgring triumph, more discussed than the 10 consecutive race wins. But that feels incomplete. Unjust even. Because what AMG accomplished between December 1996 and the end of the 1998 season was genuinely extraordinary. They built a race-winning supercar in 128 days by stealing ideas from their 2 greatest rivals and synthesizing them into something entirely new. They defeated the most dominant race car of the era, Gordon Murray's seemingly invincible F1 GTR. They held off Porsche's best effort. They won championships. And they built 25 of the most uncompromising, spectacular, and historically significant road cars ever produced. The CLK GTR existed in the last true era of unlimited GT racing, that brief, spectacular window when manufacturers could throw unlimited resources at barely regulated machines and produce something that felt genuinely dangerous, genuinely alive, genuinely beyond the reach of ordinary automotive thinking. Among the Porsche 911 GT1 and the McLaren F1 GTR, the CLK GTR stood as the most dramatic of the 3, the one built fastest, born from the most audacious premise, powered by the most operatic engine, and ultimately most destructive to the world it dominated. The V12 that powered those 20 coupes and 6 roadsters would go on to inspire Horacio Pagani, who took everything he learned from building it and poured that knowledge into the Zonda, a machine that launched an entirely new dynasty of hypercars. That is the CLK GTR's lasting contribution. Not just the championships it won or the series it destroyed, but the fire it passed forward. Today, the surviving examples are museum pieces. Climate-controlled, pampered, occasionally consigned to auction houses where collectors trade them like the blue-chip investments they've become. They sit still, silent, their V12s cold, their tires never scrubbing the surface they were designed to conquer. But start one up, if you're ever that fortunate, and for a moment, the spirit of a stripped-paint racing car from 1934 fills the room. The Silver Arrow never really died. It just learned how to be very, very expensive.